Hi, my name is Alex, and in this episode of Magic Missile Minis, I'm going to be continuing my Space Marine Diorama project. More specifically, I'm going to be making the rest of the actual diorama part of the diorama. So, as you can see here, this is where we left off the project last video. As I believe I mentioned in the last video, the idea for this project is they're going to be hanging from a large cliff, being attacked by some monster. Unfortunately, by the time I started this project, the base I had ordered hadn't come in yet, so for now I'm just going to be using this white circle to give me some idea of how big it needs to be. The way I'm going to go about doing this is by taking these two pieces of foam and shaping them into the cliff face, starting by taking this longer piece of foam and cutting it so that it's going to sit at an angle in relation to the rest of the base. And I do some of these larger cuts with a jigsaw blade. I then cut out a circular shape into the piece of foam I'm going to be actually attaching the base to. Not being too precious with this because I know I'm just going to change it once I have the base that I'm actually going to be using for this project. But just like before, I cut that using a jigsaw blade, but also for some of these smaller cuts, I actually switch over to an X-Acto blade that I just have extended as long as it can go. And here you can kind of see how everything is going to come together. The next thing I'm going to do is figure out how the larger piece of foam is going to attach itself to the other piece. So to make this as seamless as possible, I then cut out the shape I need from the larger piece of foam based off of the shape of the piece of foam that's going to attach itself to the base. Once again, chopping that up with a jigsaw blade. Here you can see the two pieces of foam kind of lined up with each other. Although later on, I end up adding another piece of foam to this because it wasn't tall enough. I then start to figure out how I'm going to attach the miniatures to this top piece of foam. So I mark out where the feet are going to be in relation to the hand that's going to be at the top of the cliff, and mark out a wedge that I'm going to cut out of this top piece of foam. Cutting that out with my X-Acto blade. And here you can kind of see what I was trying to achieve, making the cliff conform to the position that these guys are in. I then start to chop up this top piece of foam to start making it look more like a cliff or a rocky surface as opposed to just a block of foam. I don't need to be too exact with this process. The only thing that I really need to be careful of as I'm doing this is making sure I don't ruin the little section that I made where the miniatures are going to be. And my main goal at this point is to make sure that everything looks as natural as possible. But again, it's not super important right now because I'm going to be doing this even more later on when I have all the pieces of foam attached to one another. I also add this tiny little bit of foam here to add to where the miniatures are going to be standing, because I noticed when I had cut it, the miniatures' feet were at a little bit of an angle, so they didn't quite line up perfectly. And this piece of foam is going to account for that. And I attach that to the rest of the foam using a shortened toothpick. After this, I have to start editing the actual base of this large piece of foam to make sure that the miniatures are actually angled correctly and it looks like they're actually kind of hanging off of a cliff and not suspended at some weird angle. I then continue to cut up the foam until it's the right shape for what I need, slicing off bits here and there to make sure that it looks somewhat natural and not top heavy or anything like that. Once I've got that in the right size that I need it to be, I take an extra little bit of foam that I mentioned I was going to cut out earlier and use some toothpicks to attach those two things together. And once those guys are connected, I can take my craft knife and start to shave off the bottom piece so that it flows seamlessly into the top piece. And then once the two pieces of foam are as seamless as I can get them, I cut away a little bit more out the top piece to make sure that it's the shape that it's going to need to be. After that, I attach it to the last piece of foam in the same way and start to cut away at that and line it up with not only the other pieces of foam, but also with the base that I actually finally got. And here you can see the final form of the rocky cliff that the miniatures are going to be hanging off of. Since I plan on using an aerosol spray primer on the foam, I need to seal it first. So I take some Mod Podge and mix it in with some flour to give it some more substance, and I coat everything with several thick layers of this. Once I've done that, I also take some green stuff and cover up all of the seams and other holes that are in this to make it nice and smooth. And here's a little turnaround of what it looks like after I've added all the green stuff. And then I attach this to the base I'm going to be using some hot glue. Similarly to the Mod Podge, I need to make sure that I create a seal around the edge of the foam. Because again, if I'm using an aerosol spray and there's any part of this isn't covered, the aerosol spray is just going to eat away at the foam. So as you can see me doing here, I cover in one more layer of Mod Podge before adding the primer. The primer I use for this isn't actually miniature primer, it's just some primer spray that I got from the hardware store, since I'm not trying to keep any specific details for this. With that done, I can start working on the monster that is going to be assailing the Space Marines. So I take these 2 long thick wires and I'm going to be using those as 4 large tentacles. And so as you can kind of see here, I wrap the 2 around each other and then go in to add a little bit of tin foil to kind of secure them in place a little bit better. And on top of that, I add another wire that wraps around the tinfoil ball and juts out of it, and I'm going to be using that bit of wire to attach this to the base itself with a large amount of hot glue, as you can see here. Before I start adding any milliput, one of the things I wanted to do was give it a lot of teeth. And this was an old project that I had kind of given up on from a while back, but I really liked the several layers of teeth in this project. So I decided to salvage the part that I liked for this project. I then add a little bit more tinfoil onto the main body of the monster, and then I can start actually adding on some milliput. I start by taking some flat pieces of milliput and cover up all of the tinfoil. And then onto that I add the teeth that we had chopped up from the other project earlier on. Then, to make sure that the teeth we added is securely on the monster, and to build out the body of the monster, I take this thick roll of milliput and surround the teeth with it, sculpting that into the rest of the body of the monster. I then continue to build out the shape of the monster since I want to add one more row of teeth onto it. But before I get to that, I take some more milliput and sculpt it around these wires to create the tentacles, making the tentacles that are attached to the rock and cliff actually kind of go past where the wire is and then curl up. At this point, I wanted to attach the miniatures to the actual cliff face because one of the tentacles, as you can see on the miniatures, is getting chopped in half by one of them, so I didn't want to finish that until the miniatures were in place. So I dig out some little divots into their feet and add some wires that I can use to attach them onto the foam cliffside with, as you can see me doing right here. Then, to act as an adhesive, I add a little bit of green stuff into the gaps between the cliffside and the feet of these miniatures. It makes them look a little bit more realistically attached to the cliff face, as well as, of course, as I mentioned earlier, actually being an adhesive. While I let that set, I take these little mouth things from an old Tyranid set that I got, and I'm going to use those to add some interest onto the sides of the monster, shaving off the little pointy bits off of the sides of them, then use some milliput to attach them onto the monster itself. After adding a bunch of those onto the miniature, I can finally add the last tentacle, lining that up with the miniatures that are now attached to the cliff. I now add a thick ring of milliput around the mouth to act as the gums for the last ring of teeth that I wanted to add. I unfortunately couldn't find the footage of me actually sculpting out the gums, but here you can see what they looked like. I basically used primarily my metal sculpting tool to create this feel. But once those set, I can start adding on the teeth, sculpting those into a vaguely triangular shape with my rubber sculpting tools, and adding a little bit of detailing and texturing with a needle afterwards. And I then just continue the very lengthy process of doing this for all of the teeth. I then add more green stuff to create the lip of the creature that's going to go around the mouth, being a little bit more precise and careful since this is going to be the last layer around this creature. As you can see me doing here, I also add little bits of milliput to go in between the mouths that we had added earlier from the Tyranid set, trying to create the same feel that I had for my Tyranid project I did a little while ago, and you can check that out in the link in the card. And I then repeat this process around the rest of the miniature as well. The next thing I wanted to work on was the water that I was going to have the monster kind of bursting out of. Since I needed a lot, I got some air dry clay from my local art store. And then I add about an inch or so of this air dry clay around the base of the diorama. It was interesting sculpting with the air dry clay since I had gotten so used to sculpting with milliput and green stuff. But either way, once I have the height to where I want it to be, I start adding a little bit more of the air dry clay to create a wavy texture for the water. For now, I'm only focusing on the flatter parts of the water since I'll be doing the crashing waves later. And then, of course, I go around the rest of the miniature doing the same, adding the air dry clay and texturing it so that it actually looks like flowing water. While I let the air dry clay dry, I go ahead and add a little bit of green stuff and sculpt the Space Marine's hand that is going to be kind of clasped onto the cliff face. And as you can see here, rather than sculpt out each individual finger, I add one piece of green stuff in the general shape of all the fingers, chopping them out with a craft knife. With that finish, I start to work on the crashing waves like I mentioned earlier, and for this I'm actually using milliput since I can sculpt with it a little bit better. And I'm gonna be honest, I was just kind of winging it just to see what might look good, and what I figured out you can do with the milliput is that you can actually make it kind of crumble in on itself, which seemed to me to be the best option for like the foaming crashing waves. So I add this effect around the entirety of the miniature, or not the entirety of the miniature, but all the areas that I felt like it would make sense for there to be large crashing waves. I then attach the tentacle that's being chopped in half to the sword of the Space Marine, kind of attaching them together with a little bit of green stuff and using the excess green stuff to create a bit of a texture onto the inside of the tentacle that's being chopped in half. I then take some green stuff and put that on a spare miniature base, and I sculpt that into kind of like a grody splatter of sorts that I'm going to attach onto the chain sword of the Space Marine. And once those are finished, I add a little bit more green stuff onto the other side so that it's not just flat on one side, giving a little bit of texture. With that done, the milliput has set, and to make sure that it doesn't just fall apart when I start painting it, I take some super glue and coat all of the crashing waves in that, and that creates a good seal around it, locking everything in place. Then make sure to add the viscera that we had made with the green stuff onto the chain sword. Then the entirety of the diorama is ready for painting. As far as this part of the project, I'm fairly happy with how it turned out, although I have no clue whether the waves are actually going to look like waves. I think they will, but we'll have to see once I can actually paint it. On the other hand, I'm really happy with how the monster turned out. It looks exactly like I imagined it, which doesn't happen all the time, so it's very exciting. But anyways, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell to get notified when I release new videos and when the third and final part of this project gets released. If you have any questions about miniature sculpting or suggestions for future videos, leave them in the comments below. But anyways, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video.